So we're going to start out with really basic things, nothing too complicated, and just work our way through each one of the basic concepts to give you an idea of the syntactical capabilities and restrictions that are put into place for the language. So, first thing we're going to start out with is what I feel the most important thing in writing code, a comment. It's often skipped over in tutorials, and many people don't explain it. I think it's a good thing to start and really drive this home. Good code, good commenting go hand in hand. So, a couple ways you can do comments in PHP. You can do a slash star, star slash, a slash slash, or I also believe you can do a hash sign. So depending on what you so fit and what you feel comfortable with, your personal preference, any one of those will do. Again, please note, these two are single line comment versus anything in between the slash star and star slash will be considered a comment. So quick way to comment out large amounts of code can be to comment slash slash uncomment. So quick little tip there. All right, well, moving on. Another thing that I really see people skipping over a lot with tutorials, and I thought would be a good thing to point out, is the specifics of how to actually print out information from the actual PHP script to something that you can view or something that is readable later on by the user. And so there are a couple of methods that exist out there, as I have a couple of these commented out. So the first one, of course, is error log, and this is one of the most widely used and misused forms. You have to be really careful when doing this. Don't just error log everything. You can fill up a log script, a log file very quickly on the server, and it can get very frustrating to look through the logs to even find helpful information. So I like to reserve error log for just specific or very important errors that may arise in the code, and rarely do I actually leave an error log running, because it can sometimes be considered a security vulnerability to be throwing errors that could be later intercepted, or of course not intercepted, but read by whomever. So printar, that's another way you can, of course, print, and that's I believe will also print to an error location. There's the print and the echo, which are a little bit different than these two, of course. The difference, of course, between that being that printing an echo will reply with data to the requester. So if you were to call this script and from a, whether or not it was a HTML or whether it was a net framework, however you were trying to communicate, there's a few different ways you can, of course, call a script, which I'll talk about that in a different video actually. But the idea is that you can echo back or print information back from the PHP file. And just to keep it simple, just think of it like a response from the PHP script. Just without getting extremely complicated and complex there with what's going on. The idea is that when you, of course, run the file, it would then respond with hello world. And an example of that usually is one of the first things that people will do when they first start using PHP is they'll create a PHP script and they'll load it up onto a server which requires which has the PHP in the library available. Then it runs and of course prints back to the request document, oh hey, here's some information. So that's basically print and echo. They do similar things. There are some slight differences between those, but again, for brevity, just to understand that those are the most basic of forms of sending information back from the PHP script. Is probably the best way to discuss that. So, next thing I want to talk about is variables. So, a variable, if PHP is your first programming language, unfortunately, this tutorial is not going to go into the basic theory of programming, but just understand that variables are something that stores information. So, in PHP, a variable is not quite the same as it is in JavaScript or in C, where in JavaScript you'll have precursors like var, let, and the sense declaring some sort of pretense for your variable that you then give a name, and then of course store a value to it. Of course in C, the type specific programming you'll get where you have to declare different integer and character and whatnot types, or like in Java as well, is not seen in PHP. PHP is more of a static type declaration. So as you can see here, in PHP there's really no type declaration as far as saying, oh, okay, well this is a string, and this is a character, and this is a number, and whatnot. Now understand that there is a way to check for that, which I'll talk for later, but when initializing it and when creating the variable, you really do not need to say, okay, this is this is that. But what do you need to do? Well, in PHP, which a lot of people complain about, you use what's called a $sign. Well, in the American term, the $sign. And so what you essentially saying is this, anything after this until the next open space is going to be a variable name. And so in simple assignment, using an equal sign, you assign whatever value you want to the variable on the left. As you can see, I gave a few examples there, and then echoed back using a combination of the variable and then just directly pairing a string with it. And this is a common thing that people forget or mess up. In PHP, you don't use a plus sign like you do in Java. You use a period. And so as you can see here, I've written text, name, semicolon, space, and then adjoined them or concatenated them, if you will, using the plus sign, or using the period instead of the plus sign, like you may think that, versus that, which then of course you have to include your $sign and the name itself. So, but wait, I did lie there. There are some actual predefined names, and I'm not going to go into each one of these and what each one of these does, but there are ways that you can create private or public or have global or protected or static variables in the PHP language. So if you understand the programming theory behind using a static variable, behind using a global variable, which I will talk about globals briefly. Static variables, again, that's a programming theory concept, but the idea is that the static works similar to that of C programming language. So if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to look that up. Of course, for brevity, I'm not going to go into these specifically because a lot of these involve underlying programming theory, which I do not want it to take a tangent and go directly off into those. Those would be something I'd want to make a specific video about. So I do apologize if you were looking for that explanation in this video. I'll try and make another video specifically about these concepts and using PHP maybe or other languages as examples. So moving on, of course you can use arithmetic calculations, doing plus, minus, multiply, and divide, and the order of operations in PHP stands true. So of course, adding things and multiplying things, will happen according to their dominance in the mathematical order of operations. So if you're not familiar with that, go and look that up. That's a whole nother video, of course, in and of itself as well. So here you can see I just did a little demonstration of that, and then echo back. You'll see a lot of echo backs in this tutorial because the idea is that when you run this, which I will have it available on GitHub so that you can download it and work your way through it as you're watching this video. Make sure that when the script is done, you have some way of seeing what you've done on the script, and a really good way of doing that is to use an echo statement. So what you will do is you'll have information running in the background, functions or functionality running in the background, and you won't be able to see it. And so how do you know what happened? Well, you use the echo statement. So that's kind of a good example of what I was trying to explain here above with the different types of doing echo or print and whatnot there. So the next thing I wanted to move into after talking about the arithmetic informations is basic arrays. So we talked about variables before, pretty simple. So if you don't understand what a array is, again, it's an underlying programming topic or programming theory, but in brief, think of it like you have a big box and then you have a bunch of tiny boxes inside of it with indexed or numbering on them to tell you what order they belong in. Basically, that's how an array works in PHP, but there's some kind of differences there. I shouldn't say difference. There's some specific differences that allow you to be more specific with not just having an index on the box, but you can also do it in a different way. So I'll show you what I mean by that. So of course there's 3 different types of arrays. Can't just be one. There's always got to be more difficult. But don't worry, it's not that difficult. I'll explain the differences between the 3, and I have some examples to show you as well. So using arrays is not too difficult and can be really useful when designing programs that would not technically be possible without the use of maybe an array. Maybe you could do it, but efficiency-wise, effectivity-wise, length of code-wise, arrays are just indispensable. So first time, go through here. You might not understand what I'm talking about, so pause it, go back, listen again, and hopefully this will help hammer out any confusion you have. So we'll talk about numerical arrays first. What do I mean by numerical array? So when I was talking to you a second ago, I said, well, it's one big box with a bunch of little boxes inside of it. So imagine you have a box and you have things in each one of those boxes, but you need them to be in order. So on those boxes, when you're putting the littler boxes in this one big box, which the one big box is like your array, each one of these little boxes gets a number so that it goes in the box in a certain order and you know where it's at. That way, in case, the box got jumbled, or say you were trying to explain to someone else which little box inside there you needed. You could say, I need box number 4. And someone would look inside the box and say, okay, box number 4. That's the fundamental idea behind how a basic, indexed array is going to work. So you'll have indexes, 0 being the first one, which is odd, but of course 0 is the base, then 1, then 2, and etc. on until you run out of space. Pretty straightforward. You can see here I've made an array. There's a few ways you can do array declarations. One way is you can use the array keyword and then put values inside the array separated by commas. And then of course different types will have no effect on the actual array itself. Something to understand is that arrays and values and variables in PHP can be thought of as objects. It's just an object. So you're just taking an object, and it doesn't matter if it's the number 4, the number 2, the character 3, the number 3, or the word 4. None of that matters in PHP as far as putting them, grouping them together. So you can just take everything and put it into a little box. Well, whatever order that you put these in this declaration statement here, it will then assign automatically that order as the index. So 1 would have index 0, 2 would have index 1, the character 3 would have index 2, and the word 4 would have the index 3. So it might be confusing saying that like that, but that's kind of the point there. Is it really doesn't matter. They just end up as 0, 1, 2, and 3. And what do I mean by that? Well, here might be a better way of showing you that. So I can do the same thing I did here, creating a basic array, but I can do it like this, where I write out the name and then I create an index directly and store it directly to that index. So here you can see 1 was stored. And another thing here is, so when you have single quotes versus double quotes in PHP, it does not recognize the difference between those as far as in this example how this is concerned. So as you're storing these values, so storing the word 1 in single quotes versus the word 1 in double quotes wouldn't actually make a difference there. So that's what I meant by that. So as you can see here, we had another basic array, 0, 1, 2 are the indexes. So in these little tiny boxes, so another basic array is the big box, and the little tiny boxes, or slots if you will, inside the big box are numbered, and the values are stored inside those little slots. And to get those back, or to call those essentially to use those values, is just as simple as saying, hey, here's the name and I want this index. So as you can see here, I said echo another basic array. I could also do the same thing and also echo basic array and say, well, I want 2, and that would give the output of 3 right there. As I said, this one would output nachos with meat. Alright. Now, like I said, there's kind of a little bit of a twist. When it comes to arrays and some other languages that might throw you if you've never seen it before. So there's something in PHP called an associative array. Now, associative arrays are really not that difficult, and there's really not that much to be afraid of. And to be honest, when you make the connection, you'll kind of probably laugh at yourself for thinking they're, kind of challenging. So what's actually happening is, so see here, we assign a number, an index number, and then that index number represents the location of the value. Well, down here, instead of having a number, we use a name. So type is now the association for Cobra. And so kind of a way you can use this is you can use this naming as an organizational convention. I've seen this done before. I'll do this occasionally. Where say you'll have an array and we'll call it snake1. Well, we can have it have a type, and we can, say, is it venomous dangerous? Well, okay. And what's its length? What length could it possibly be? I think cobras can actually only get to about 6 feet, so maybe 6 or 8 feet, maybe, who knows? So 8 feet maximum, maybe. We're just guessing there. But yeah, so this should start to kind of see where it could be useful as you understand it more and more. When you make the connection with how to use this with other types of languages like HTML and JavaScript, for example, you'll notice that this object type associative array goes hand in hand with those other languages too, and also hands itself to JSON files, which is another thing that I would encourage, if you don't already understand, to look into those. It's a way of storing data that kind of follows a similar management setup. So you have a name, and then you'll have values underneath them represented as associative values to the name. Now we can take that one step further. Of course, before we do, let me point out, accessing that value is the exact same way we did before with the number, but this time we just use the name. So that should be the connection, the aha point for you right there when you say, oh, okay, well, there's really no difference here. I'm just giving it a number, I'm just giving it a name. But if you really wanted to blow your mind, if I do this and I say echo snake1 and I go 0, guess what? It also outputs. So what happens is, oh, okay, well, type is given as the associative value, but the underlying array functionality still kind of works the same, and you can actually access that value just the same with the index. And so this kind of idea is a key value association. So you'll have a key that's associated with a value. And that key also can have an index association, and usually does have that as the underlying structure, and we just kind of tack on a name on top of it to make it nice. So hopefully that kind of helps you work through associative arrays. That was a little confusing. Rewind it, go back and listen through again there. The big thing here is just to understand that instead of using a number, we use a name to represent its location in the array. Here's where we kind of can put most people into a headache situation. When you start talking about multi-dimensional arrays, I mean, just looking at this probably makes you think, oh, okay, well, that's just ugly. I just don't like that, and I don't know what that is, and that's scary. But really, you shouldn't, because if you can grasp your head around what an associative array is, doing multi-dimensional arrays is really quite simple. If you take a step back and look at what's happening here, you should start to really see the similarity between object storage, associative storage, and JSON files, and kind of the entire data structure that represents this. And if you don't, if you're struggling with it, pause and study this kind of for a second until you understand what I'm talking about, because this is really important to understand and will really make your code powerful when you can grasp this concept. So what's actually going on here with this multi-dimensional array is really quite simple. We have one big array from here to down here that's storing all of this information inside here. So we have one big array that kind of acts as the first box. And think of it like you're moving somewhere, right? And when you move somewhere, you take a bunch of little boxes and you put stuff in those little boxes, and you take all those little boxes and you put them in one big box and you put a name on it and you say, that's the kitchen. So for this example, we have the condiments box that you took out of your, say you're running a restaurant and you need to do an inventory of your current, condiments. Well, say everything needs to be stored in one big box because you have to move your business. So you have to do an inventory and keep track of all that stuff. So one nice, neat little way is to do it with a little structure like this. And say this was in an online situation where you had to enter all this into forms and store that all in as forms. And that's where this becomes really handy. Because what you could do is say, oh, okay, well, my one big box is my condiments box. Okay, so that's all the stuff that I have. And here you see, okay, well, I have a few different types of condiments. They come in bottles. Well, I also have packets that I give out to customers. And then I have big tubs that I use for when I'm making like big batches of stuff. And so, of course, each different thing's going to have subcategories to it. So, one way to do it would be, okay, well, I'm going to make a bunch of different arrays and just make one array for bottles and one array for packets and one array for tubs, and then just access them each individually. And you can do that, and that's fine. But if you wanted to be more organized with the way you're accessing things and more neat and be able to group things into one object to make it easy to pass it around, you use multi-dimensional arrays in this format. In this associative format especially makes it easy, because then we can say, oh, okay, well, now the bottles specifically, I have a bunch of different types of those too, because they're kinds of bottles, right? We have ketchup, and we have mustard, and we have taco sauce, and hot sauce, and barbecue sauce, and so on. But in addition to having those types, we have to keep track of the numbers of each one of those types. And that's where you really see these associative arrays shine, because then I can say, well, hey, the index is, well, that's ketchup, and I know I got 100 bottles of ketchup. Well, and this is, of course, the numbers here are just crazy random numbers, so don't worry about the actual numbers to these here. But the idea to understand is that, oh, okay, this name now represents this number, and I can do this a few different times. Well, I can do the same thing for packets, the same thing for tubs, and then what do you know? I have this really nicely packed little multi-dimensional array with all my information that's accessible in a really nifty way. Well, how is that? Let me show you. Of course, using our handy dandy echo button. What we do here, I should say button, echo statement, we simply call our original array, which was condiments, remember? We created our initial first array, which is our large array. And then we say, okay, well, in that large array, I have an associative index or an associative array that is called tubs, and I want to know the value stored for ketchup. And then here we go. It'll tell you, well, I have 10. Because that's what you put here. Now, if that doesn't make sense, let me see if I can hopefully clear it up in one quick explanation. So, when you go to the grocery store and you go to look for something at the grocery store, you go to the grocery store. Well, inside the grocery store, each grocery store has aisles. And in each one of those aisles, there are sections that have items. Well, each one of those aisles usually has a name, like foodstuffs. And then each one of the sections usually has a name, like, sauces. And then each one of the sections have different products that have different names that are associated to the same product. So that's the exact same thing as what's going on here. And that's why it's so nifty and why it's so handy to use this kind of associative indexing in PHP, because it makes it really easy to access your data. So just remember, the first name, the variable name that you put down there, is going to be the grocery store, or the main array, if you will. And then the indexes are kind of the sub-associations, the arrows, if you will, that kind of point you in the direction to the data that you're looking for. So hopefully that clears that up if any of you had any difficulty with that. So next thing I want to talk about is functions. Functions are amazing in PHP. Allow you to do, just like in any other programming language, a massive amount of flexibility. Programming without functions is impossible. I mean, you would not have modern programming, of course. And functions in PHP, much to the same as C. You will see them function just as you will call them. They will return a value. You can pass values into functions, and when they are finished using that value, it of course needs to be returned because of the scope, and I'll explain what that means here in a second as well. So a brief outline of a function is you have to say function to tell the PHP script, okay, well, after this is going to be a function. You give it a name, and then in functions, of course, if you want to do something with a value that exists outside of the function. So remember, anything inside the function exists only to the function inside of it unless you pass information into it. Think of it like you have something in a room in your house, and the only way something can get into that room is if you carry it in there to use it, and the only way it's going to get back out is if you carry it back out when you're done. Same idea with the function. So here we say, well, we're going to pass in a paintbrush, and we're going to say the paintbrush is going to be a happy little tree. And of course, we named it B. Ross. And then when we're done, after setting paintbrush, we have to send it back so that we knew what paintbrush was set to. So we say return, and then of course the variable name. So pretty simple, pretty basic function. This is about as simplistic as they can get. You can also have functions that don't return things. That's the simplest they get. Usually that would be, instead of doing a return, you would do something like echo I'm in a function, and just to be fun, we could return paintbrush, or echo paintbrush, excuse me. As you can see here, I went ahead and did a little bit of a demonstration of that function. So we went ahead and created a variable outside of the function, and I'll do a little bit of an explanation on scope here in just a moment. So hopefully you will get a little better of an understanding of what I mean by outside of the function. But we create a variable outside of the function, and then we say, okay, well, I'm going to call this function, and then here's that variable that we created, and I'm going to pass that into the function, and then when it's done, whatever is sent back, or whatever is returned in this case, I want that value to be stored in this canvas variable. So remember, when you're declaring variables, you have the name, and you put the $sign there, of course, and say equals, so whatever comes out of this function from this return statement, then of course stores into canvas. So you heard me say a couple of times, well, I'll show you what scope is, I'll show you what scope is. So here we go. Let's talk about scope. So the idea of what scope is, and the whole ideal of it is, think of like a scope on a weapon or of some sort. And when you look into the scope, it allows you to see farther, and it allows you to see something farther. But without that scope, you can't see those objects necessarily, or they're too far off in the distance to make out, so they're irrelevant to you. Well, that's kind of the same idea with programming scope. And so you have a few different levels of scope in PHP, and we're just going to talk about the basic one here for this introductory tutorial with global scope declaration, and how global scope declaration behaves with functions. So, of course, like I said, in the beginning, there are ways that you can declare things as global using a keyword. And that's this right here. And I'll show you where that comes into play. Just one moment. So first thing to note is I'm going to declare a variable, and this is going to be considered a global scope declaration. Now here's an important thing to understand. Looking at this document that I have right here, you'll notice that everything in this document is basically existing in a single plane. And what I mean by that is, okay, well, I open the document, I create the document, and all of these commands, error log, print, these variable declarations, these array declarations, the multi-dimensional array, even the function, all of these are done at what's considered the global scope level. And by that global scope level, I mean that this document, in our case, bobross.php, is actually considered the global scope. So anything on the document level, meaning when you create it and it's just written directly into that document. And that might be kind of a hard idea to grasp your head around. It took me a second when I first heard it way back in the day. And so hopefully you understand the idea behind global. But in PHP, just remember that whatever is in this document or included in this document, and I'll talk more about that later, but meaning if you have another file that you also include in here, these values will be global to that too, meaning that anywhere that I make this Bologna or character or name variable, I have access to that variable on this global level. So if whether or not I am up at the top of this document or all the way at the bottom of this document, I can use the name variable. And so anywhere where I type that name variable, as long as I'm on this first level, if you will, of global scope, that name is valid. That name variable will be valid for the original value or values you set thereafter. Now, what do I mean by the first level of scope? Wouldn't you hear me say that? What am I talking about there? Well, when you dive into a depth or another level or a different scope, if you will, what you're doing is you're going into a function or a class, which I'll talk about later, is a little more specific, but you're going into this kind of cordoned off area where things that you once had aren't accessible to you anymore, but you're kind of working in this clean little environment that you can, do what you want. So in essence, you're, think of it like I said, a room in your house. You can have a room that maybe you do some arts and crafts, or you do electronics, or you have your computer room. And so that room is just specifically for doing that, and it has a task that it does. So instead of having all of your stuff, everything you own, your bedroom and your kitchen and everything all in just one room, you divide it up into these different rooms, and they each have their own task. But, of course, if you're in your bedroom, you can't cook food now because your stove's in your kitchen. Well, that's kind of the same idea with scope and function scope, and the idea of variable scope and function scope and accessing variables from different layers of scope or levels of scope, is that when I have a global variable, it would be the same as existing, say, maybe out in a family room. It's or in an, think of it like a global would be like an open warehouse where it might take you some time to go and access it or to go and find it, but it's going to be somewhere on the warehouse floor. Whereas with a function, this would be like a room in your house where, like I said, you have to carry something into it and then carry something back out of it, but nothing else outside that room could affect what's going on inside that room. And that's why it's important, and that's where this scope comes into handy. Because then I can do something like, okay, well, I'm going to take this variable, I'm global, and I'm going to name it up here. And now, okay, well, anybody in this global scope can use it. But say I want to have the same, I'm global name in here. For some reason, I want to, because the way my program's designed or something or whatnot, I just feel like using the same name. Or there's a reason why you would want to do this in programming, but I'm not going to go into it. We'll just keep it simple with it's just because we want to use the same name. Well, you can't do that, of course, in programming, because if you have the same name, then if you try and store something to it, it'll have conflicts. So when I make this global here, this is actually a local scope of the same variable. And this is where you should kind of start to see, if you've been confused up to this point, you should kind of make the connection here. If I can type. There we go. Here, I'm global, and here I'm global are actually two different things. And so this value right here and this value right here, although they have the same name, they have a different scope. And what do I mean by that? Well, they actually represent two different things. And that's basically what scope is. So the function creates a new layer, and anything declared inside that new layer is local to that function. And that's scope. And that scope in many different programs functions the same way. Many different programming languages, the scope functions the same way. C and C++ behave very similar as far as scope functionality as PHP does. The situation might come across where, say I want to declare a global variable from inside a function. It's sometimes not considered best practice to do this, but maybe there's a situation where you just couldn't help it. You needed to do it. Well, the way you can do it is by one of those keywords that I kind of alluded to before. You can actually tack on a global in front of one of your variable name declarations, and then that will then actually make it accessible from outside the function. So now if I was to actually go echo, in this case, I am global too, or I am global, it too will be accessible just like I'm local, where if I try and do this, it will throw an error because it will say it's not defined. So as you can see, that will echo as desired there. So hopefully that kind of helps you out with scope there. Scope can kind of be a difficult thing to understand, and this is the really basic explanation, really quick and dirty, down and dirty behind scope. The walk away from it is that when you create something like a function, you're essentially creating a little cordoned off area that whatever is inside that function can only be accessed or used inside that function, and then you need to have a way of returning that, of course, and that is why you'll see return statements like I had before, and that would allow you to pass the value out. So if you actually wanted to pass this I'm local value out, you could call the fname function and it would then do the echo. So if we wanted to we'll call FA name, all right, there we go. So now this would output local for us. And this, of course, would print out global 2, and I am local would throw an error for being not defined. And I'll show you how to handle errors here later on in this tutorial. Alright, so the next thing we're going to talk about with the PHP language is going to be decision structures. How to use decision structures, what decision structures are, and a few of the different examples of how to use those decision structures in PHP. Of course, the first one, which almost everybody's familiar with, you see them everywhere, is the if statement. Of course, you have if, some clause, something to execute, or if the clause fails, you execute some other code. So, if-else statements. As we can see here, we have a variable cat equal to Tom and tornado equal to warning. So, if in this example, cat is equal to Tom, we echo found my cat, and we set cat to mott. But if the value of cat did not equal Tom, we would echo no kitty. But with this if statement, of course, you see we have this double equal sign, which is saying, oh, okay, well, I want to compare the value here with the value here. And we say, oh, okay, no problem. Cat is now compared with the value Tom, and we say, oh, that passes, so we execute this statement and not this statement. So here you might say, oh, well, what's the difference between this? Well, I'm getting confused here already. Well, don't be. When you use one equal sign, it assigns a value. That's an assignment statement. When you do two equal signs, or when you have two equal signs next to each other, that is a comparative statement, and that compares the value on either side as objects. Of course, you can do compound conditional statements. So you can say, if this, else, if this, else do this. So you can see, I have a little example of that there. Basically what's happening is you're saying, well, if this first statement or condition fails, then try this condition, and if that condition also fails, then finally do this. You can do that as many times as you want, and that arguably is not necessarily a good practice. There are better ways to handle that, but that's a whole different argument in and of itself. We won't go into that. Just remember that the takeaway here is you have a statement that allows you to make decisions, and you can check to see that the value in the decision is equal to the value that you specify. Well, we kind of run into something, and I alluded to it a moment ago, but PHP kind of has a quirk to it, and it's the triple equal sign. And this is where most people kind of just quit, and they say, okay, well, I'm done for the day. But lo and behold, don't worry, I'm here to save you. That's what this whole tutorial is about. Alright, so don't worry, I'll give you the dirty low. So, like I said before, when you have one equal sign, because right, like what? Wait. There's one, there's two, there's three equal signs. What are you talking about? Okay, we'll clear it up for you. Don't worry. Hang on to your britches. So with PHP, like I said, the first usage is with a single equal sign, and that's when you have an assignment statement. Meaning, of course, like we've said about 5 or 6 times already, you have a variable with a name, and it is equal to the value that you put on the right-hand side. Of course, $sign to indicate that the variable name is being initialized. Or excuse me, the variable name to indicate that it is a variable name that has been initialized or that you are initializing. So, comparative operator is the next one that we just touched on, the double equal sign. And remember, it's different. So, variable equal hello versus variable is equal to hello. Simply saying, okay, well, I'm comparing the value on the left and the value on the right as objects, and I'm saying, are these equal to each other? Now, let's look at this for a second. So we made our variable and we made it the string hello. Okay, so then our variable, of course, when checked against the string hello, evaluates to true. Cool, okay, great. So let's do another one. Okay, well, this time we say, well, our variable is equal to 4, the string 4. Well, that of course fails, because that's not true. So, where am I going with this? Well, let's do a little bit of something fun here. Well, what happens if we make variable equal, our variable equal to the number 4? But we make another variable this time called variable 2, and we set it equal to the string 4. Well, let's see what happens. Let's do a little if statement here, take a look at them both. What do you think? And, well, what do you know? They pass. Wait a second. The number 4 is not the same as the word 4, the letter 4, the character 4. What's going on here? Something's not right here. But it does, because 4 and 4 are the same objects in PHP. Can kind of be weird, can kind of be hard to understand, but essentially it breaks down like this. You have a dog. Everybody recognizes that a dog is a dog. A dog is an object. When you see a dog, you say, oh, that's a dog. You don't say, oh, well, that is a long-haired 9-year-old aging shepherd with short brown hair and blah 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 blah. You just compare it as an object. You take it as face value. Say, oh, it's a dog. Look at another dog. Well, that's also a dog. They're both dogs. All right, you win. That's what PHP does. It says, well, that's a 4. That's a 4. They're both 4s. All right, cool. We're done. Pass. Well, maybe you don't want that to happen. Maybe you want to be a little more specific. Maybe you need to tell the difference between if somebody's talking about German Shepherd versus a Dachshund. Might come in handy. So how do you do that? Well, along comes the triple equal sign. What happens? Well, it looks at it in a little more detail. It looks at it and says, what's the actual, let's look at the type of this object here. Let's kind of take a look here. And it attempts to determine the type of an object and determine whether or not these objects are equal. Now, this can get very hairy. This is a very straightforward explanation of the comparative statement and the comparative situation. It can get very specific and when you're dealing with object arrays and whatnot, it doesn't always, and it's not always as straightforward as this. So you just, when you're using this, make sure whatever you're trying to do, you think about, okay, and this is the takeaway from this, pretty much, okay, what am I going to do? What do I need to do? Do I need to just look at the letters? Do I need to look at the characters? Do I need to look at the type? Think about what you're trying to do with your program, and then knowing which one of these to to use is just straightforward. You don't even have to think about it. All right. Now, remember I said earlier, using a bunch of if statements is kind of, bad practice. So, if I look at somebody's code and I see they've written like 10 if statements, arguably there's a little neater, a little more of a picturesque, if you will, way to handle it. And it can actually be faster or a better way of doing things. And it's called the switch statement. The switch statement. Not too crazy, but pretty straightforward. So what you do is it's kind of like a if statement where you're comparing values, but instead of having, if else, if else, if else, if else like this, what you do is you come down here and you say, okay, well, here's the value I'm passing in, cat in this case, and I'm going to compare it to a bunch of different cases, a bunch of different things, a bunch of different values, a bunch of different ideas, and then get the outcome. So you can actually compare strings and you can compare numbers. So if I wanted to do number of cats, I could have this as, 1, 2, 3 or whatever. So in this case, our first case to compare with cat is Tom. Is Tom equal to cat? Well, remember up there before we had set it to moat, so it would actually not execute any of this code. Then it would come down here and look at the second case and it'd say, oh, well, it's mot. It says yes. Okay, so it echoes out, well, that's my kitty. And then so it knows that it's done with this case, it breaks out, and the switch statement's done. Now, it is possible in this case to do something where you have multiple statements that will trigger. I'm not going to go into that. If you really like the idea of using the switch statement, I would pull up the man page for it. There's a lot of very good PHP man guides out there, manual guides or manuals or guides, if you will, that give the in-depth explanation of the exact functionality. It can be really handy for handling structured input data that might have really minute variances that you need to kind of click through, like whether or not it's a blue or a black shirt or something of that sort. So switch statements are really handy if you have a large number of things, like say you have 10 different colors of shirts and you need to know which one it is in a program, right? For some weird way, weird reason. You have some shirt color selector button, object on your web page. Well, you could use a switch statement that then returns an object, or because you can also like set a value in there or do something with that return statement that then gives you the specific color and details for all of that colored shirt. So instead of having to go, is it blue? Is it red? Is it green? And then have all those if statements. You can do it with a switch statement, a little bit cleaner. All right, so there's also another form of an if-else conditional out there, and it looks a little bit like this. So when you use this one, it does the exact same thing as the if-else statements we had up here, but it looks a little bit different. And some argue that it's a better way. Oh, they like it better. They do everything with this when they can. I personally don't use these. I don't know why. Maybe I just don't like it because it looks a little bit weird. But let me break it down for you. So the first thing here is actually the variable that stores the response from this statement. Then you're setting that value equal to whatever this statement responds with. Okay? Well, remember, return value is indicated by the $sign as the name. Then we come over here, and anything inside this bracket is the comparative statement, just like we did before when we had the comparative bracket here where we have one variable on the left, one variable on the right. And you can also use triple equal signs in here as well. So we say, is cat equal to moat? Oh, well, guess what it is. And you see you have a question mark sign there. Sorry. You can see that you have a question mark sign there, and that basically indicates to the when it's parsing the code, basically indicates, okay, after this I'm going to have two statements. The first statement is going to be if it's true, and so basically you can kind of see how this works. So you have your decision statement, question mark to say anything over here is going to be my two values as the response. If it's true, you do this. If it's false, you do that. Kind of shorter, maybe shorthand. You can argue, kind of a thing of preference. You can do either or. So remember, it's the exact same as the if-else statement. So next thing we're going to talk about is loops. So loops in PHP, right? Well, like I've said a few times already in the tutorial, PHP is similar to C, and loops also work pretty much identically as loops do in C and C++. As you can see here, we have a demonstration of a for loop. So if you've never seen a for loop before, I'll give you a quick rundown of how this works. So you start the for loop with the for keyword. You have some brackets here, or some suddenly it slipped my mind what they're called. Not brackets, but hyphens, parentheses, not parentheses. Opening and closing here. And inside these, which I just cannot remember the name for some reason. So you start basically inside this these two bracket values. Inside these, okay, that's driving me nuts. That's driving me nuts. The parentheses. They're parentheses. Thank you. Man, why couldn't I think of that? Man, brain goof there. Okay, so so you start off with a for loop, and you have an open parenthesis and a closing parenthesis, and inside those parentheses you have your value that you're going to start at. And you indicate this number, or this value, that you're going to start at with an I. And why I say value is because it doesn't necessarily have to be 0. It can be 1, it can be 2, it can be whatever you want. And then you take that value and you do a comparison. You say, okay, well, I'm going to say, is this value less than 5? And if that is, then I'm going to add one number to this number. So you start off with 0. And so if it's less than 5, you're going to add 1 to it, and then execute whatever code you have inside the brackets. So that's basically what a for loop does. It increments from 0 to whatever number you set, and executes the code inside of it as many times as you tell it to. Another way of looping is while loops. Basically, they do the same thing. You set an initial value. You say, is that initial value less or greater, or while it's equal to, or you give some conditional, and this while loop will just continue to run the code inside of it until this conditional statement finishes, or becomes false, or becomes true. Whatever you set it to. So you could have it, of course, be equal to 5. And so it would start, and when the number was equal to 5, then the while loop would terminate and no longer continue to work. You can also do something where inside of here you can break. And what will happen is by doing break, that will actually stop the loop. So say you had some error, or you had some condition that if that condition was met, you wanted this while loop to stop prematurely, you can use the break statement. Kind of similar to what you saw up in the switch statements above. There's an alternative form to the while loop called the do while loop, and it basically kind of works the same way, and the only difference it has to do with when your code executes. With the do loop will execute your code as long as the statement holds, whereas the while loop will execute the code, or the while loop, won't execute the code if the statement doesn't hold. So I believe that the difference between the do while and the while, and I probably should double check on that real quick, but I do believe the difference is that the do loop will execute once before checking the statement, whereas the while loop will not check once. I'm not 100% sure on that, don't hold me to that, but for the basic sake of this tutorial, the do while loop are basically the same. Most people will generally just use a while loop, being that it's going to continue to run while the conditional statement is valid. Alright, so let's do a little more with loops here and take a look at the for each loop. So you might be thinking, well, okay, we got another one. I'm like, yep, we got another one. The for each loop is kind of a product of associative arrays, and or excuse me, not a product of, is kind of a useful function for the associative array, because when you have an array that has a key and a value, sometimes you want to access both of those at the same time, and the for each loop can kind of give you the setup to do that rather cleanly and efficiently, whereas to do it with a standard for loop, it can also be done, but is a little bit, in my opinion, more indirect. The for each loop allows you to directly access and loop through associative arrays until they're finished. And that's the big thing, is that a for each loop will run from the beginning to the end of an associative array without specifying the length, whereas a for loop, you can say only go to this certain index or only run a certain index range inside of an associative array or an array. So remember the types there. Now, for each loops also work on multi-dimensional arrays, but I didn't go into that in this tutorial just because it's a little bit confusing. So remember, with an associative array, you have a type value pair, or a key value pair, if you will. And when you use a for each loop, you say, well, here's the array name, and I want to loop through these as a key and value pair. And to do that, or while I'm doing that, I'm going to go ahead and do whatever and use whatever blah 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 inside of your for each loop. Now the nifty thing here is now you have access to the key, which is the index name, and the value associated with that key every loop through. So at every index, if you will, you now have access directly to the key and the value, and you can do so fit as with whatever you desire. But one little thing to note is basically you're doing the same thing here as jumping through the indexes, and if you wanted to ignore the named associations, and so if you didn't really care what these index named associations were, you could basically keep track of which index you're at by just incrementing a counter, which is what I'm using or what I'm doing with this example of this I here. So essentially what you're doing is you're just starting at index 0, index 1, index 2, index 3, and so on, and you grab the key and value, remember key and value, for each one of those indexes. So you can also read a normal array using a for each loop, and instead of doing key as value, you simply provide a variable name that you want as value. So one thing to note here, this does not have to be named key, and this does not have to be named value. You can put whatever variable names you so fit inside of this loop and then use that name to access it through each recursion of through each index of the loop. So here's just another simplified for each without all the garbage in there. Here, of course, you can access it just the same way as we did before, but using the key value. And if you were to print out the key this time, remember we used our array here 1 2 3 4. Here it would go through, and if you were to do echo value, oops, I forgot to put that up here. Let me put that in here. So if you were to go through, it would echo 1 2 3 4, as in. The same would happen here. It would echo 1 2 3 4, but it would echo 0 1 2 3 and so on. Excuse me, I think in this one, let's see here, we can safely say it's going to do 0 1 2 3, obviously, because we have 4 values there, and then our associated values with there. And so just note that instead of taking the name here, because the name doesn't exist, it just prints the index. Alright, remember above I said if you include a value, it's global to everything. Well, there's a way that you can access files using include, and I think I actually talk about it later down here. I can't remember if I actually included that in this tutorial, but don't get confused with that and actually accessing a file in PHP, because that's two different things. So what I'm going to talk about now is actually accessing a file for use, meaning physically manipulating a file on your local file system using PHP. Well, there's a really down and dirty quick way. If you just want to read a file real quick, a good way to do it is, or a cheat way to do it is read file. Cheap, quick, easy. You type out your file name, make sure you use the proper directory and the proper directory listing. Of course, make sure your file exists. And then you can just go echo read file, and that would, of course, print whatever was in the tester.txt. And so when you're running this example, if you're going back through, if you want to run this example, make sure you create put a little note in here. Make sure to create a file in local directory called tester.txt. Okay. Because if you don't, of course, when you try to run this example, it would give you an error. All right, so remember, not remember. So, remembering what I said a second ago, I suppose, you can do read file a little bit better. Because what if you want to write to the file, or what if the file doesn't exist, or what if this, what if that? Okay, so the better way to actually do it is using what's called fopen. So if we use fopen, we can give it a name and a parameter, and we can also do a really quick cheat and break out if and close the file or close the script down if the file doesn't exist. And what happens is when you use fopen, it actually returns what's called a pointer to the file that it opens. And what does that pointer mean? What does that pointer do? Well, basically think of it as the cursor in a text document. And wherever that cursor or pointer is, when you tell it to write something, it's going to write it. Now, if you'll see here, I've given a quick little short rundown of what each of these little modes do, because with fopen, you can set a mode, and a mode allows you to actually change how you're interacting with that file. For example, you can open the file as a read-only if you just want to read from it, or if it's just a read-only file and you don't want to mess it up, write to the file only, saying, well, you don't really care, you just want quick access, and you're going to dump whatever's in there. One thing to note, that it will recreate the file entirely, overwrite everything from the beginning, or create a new file if it doesn't exist. And then lastly, you'll have append, where it will place the pointer, or the cursor, if you will, the imaginary cursor, at the end of whatever's in that file, and then write whatever you want to after that. There are a couple of little add-ons to it. You can use X or X plus to just create a new file, or if you want to read and write from the beginning, you can use R plus. If you want to use read write from the beginning and overwrite everything as you're going, you use W plus. And if you want to append to the end of the file, you use A plus, which is basically the same as A. So here you can see I've created a file with our file name from up above called tester.txt, and I do write plus. Well, in write plus, it will overwrite from the beginning, and in fact, it will also create a new overwrites from the beginning and creates new. And so in this case, because in this situation tester.txt doesn't work, or excuse me, tester.txt where it doesn't work up here, it would in fact work down here if you forgot to create the tester.txt file. So I'm actually going to leave it, when I put this out on GitHub, I'll leave it like this so that it doesn't throw an error when you first run it. But I wanted to show you guys an example of the quick down and dirty, so if you just wanted to play with it real quick, that's the fastest way. And the easiest to understand, I suppose. Alright. So what do you do when you open the file, right? I keep talking about this cursor, and what are you going to do with this cursor, and beginning and end, and blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, let's talk about the cursor. So the cursor allows you to, of course, write at any point, but it also allows you to read from any point. And what I mean by that is wherever you put that file pointer or that cursor, whether it's at the beginning or at the end or whatnot, you can do what's called an fgets as well, and that will get line by line, or just a single line with just fgets, and return whatever, in this case with write plus, there wouldn't be anything there. But if you opened it as a R plus and there was information in there, if you started at the first line, fgets would return the first line and store it in the line variable here. One thing to note is when you're done using fopen, you always want to close the file pointer, or excuse me, dispose of the file pointer or close the file. How do you do that? You use fclose and you pass it the file pointer. working with files has a number of operators in PHP. There's a number of library operations that you can perform that are really handy. One of the ones I wanted to talk about that's useful is file end of file. Now what this allows you to do is check to see if you're at the end of a file. Because remember in PHP, when a file is done, there's an end of file marker, or a EOF if you will. And what that tells the program is basically there's nothing else after this and I'm done. So you can use that to your advantage because you can do things like, well, say I want to get every line one line at a time and pass it into my program to parse it for some reason. Well, simple. You do a while statement like I talked about above, and we say, well, while it's not end of file, or file end of file in this case, the FEOF, and you say, okay, here's the file pointer to the file I opened, because remember, we talked about that earlier, you give it a file name and it opens it up in a certain way. In this case, it'd probably be better to do R+. And it says, oh, okay, well, it's going to read line by line, look at line by line, and return, or in this case, echo that out. And so what I think I'll actually do is when I put this on GitHub for you guys to use, I'll make sure I stick a couple of files in there with it to use as examples so that you guys don't have to populate files in order to see this working if you're just new to this. That way it'll be really simple for you. So don't worry about where these files are in this example right now. When I post it up, I'll make sure that these files have populated information on there so these echo statements work. If you're following along right now, you might have noticed that there is not anything in that file. So actually what would happen is right now, because there's nothing in this file that we created, or in this file right now, as this code stands, currently, it would actually just say, oh, well, it's already at the end of the file. So it would just skip this statement entirely. And then it would again do the same thing with this. It would skip it entirely because this is doing the same thing as we talked about above. It's looking for the end of the file, but in this case, we're using fgetC to return every character of the file one character at a time. And so I'd encourage you to look at some of the file operations. There's a few other ones that PHP has as you become more familiar with working with files. Of course, when we're done here, we always want to close the file by giving it the file pointer and calling fclose function there. All right, so what I was mentioning briefly when I first started talking about files, I hoped I had included this, and I thought I did. With PHP, you can do what is called include or require external PHP files. Not text files or data files or random files, but actual other PHP files themselves. And you can do that by using the include statement. So as you see here, when I remove that comment there, the syntax highlighting there in this in the IDE that I'm using. Actually, this word editor that I'm using is Sublime Text. Just if any of you guys were wondering. What would happen now is when this PHP file is loaded by the server, it is going to look for another file called user.php. Really simple. One thing to remember is watch your file paths. ... and single dot. Make sure that if it's in another folder, you include folders. If you don't understand file paths or system file paths, I would encourage you to make sure you understand that. When you're using include statements, it's vital to know where that file is in the system. So basically what I'm saying is you can't include a file if you don't know the proper path to it. So that's the most important thing. If the path is wrong, your server will throw an error saying that it couldn't find the file. Or you'll get a 500 error when you try to navigate to it. Or a 404, I think. 404 not found error, I think is what it throws. Okay. One really quick, minute difference here, and that's all that you really care about in this case, is we have require and include. The big difference here is if you have require, if it doesn't find that file, it just halts the script and it returns an error. Whereas if you just use include, it says, oh, okay, well, I can't find it, but I'm going to keep going. So that can be important. Keep that in mind. All right. Well, let's talk about file uploads real quick. So, file uploads. All right. Sometimes when you're using PHP, you come across a situation where you need to upload a file from a user. And PHP is really handy for this. Because, well, if you're just using HTML or JavaScript in its native form, well, when they navigate away from the page, anything that was stored potentially could go bye-bye. So, yeah, you run into a situation where, hey, I want to upload a file, or I want to upload an image file, lots of situations, a number of them. You see it all the time when browsing through the internet. PHP allows you to do that. How? Well, we can use a nice little routine coupled with some HTML, and it's pretty straightforward. So as you can see here, I hashed out a quick little HTML form for us. If we were to put this HTML into an HTML file and then have that in the same folder accompanying our Bob Ross PHP file, we could in turn do what's called a post submission. And I'm not going to go into that in this beginner tutorial in depth, but essentially what post allows us to do is the web page will communicate with our server and send information back to the server after the user has submitted the information. So what you can do is the HTML5 now will allow you to do a nice little nifty thing where it'll display on the screen a little box that you can click, and it'll pull up a little browser that you can navigate through your file system. You can then select a file and click submit. But when you're done doing that and the submit button is clicked, the HTML is done and its job is finished, and PHP then starts taking the workload. Well, what happens is actually kind of nifty. So remember, I told you I had this little nifty form in HTML. Well, I give it in the HTML tag, and if you're not familiar with HTML tags and you're trying to learn PHP, I would also encourage you to go back and learn HTML first. Don't try to learn PHP without already knowing HTML. So what I did is in my HTML tag, I added in a simple action and gave it my PHP file. And then I told it post method. So now it says, oh, okay. Well, when this submit button is clicked, I'm going to send the file name as post information with the ID file up name. Okay, well that's great because PHP can snag that post information, and that file that you uploaded is also passed in a nice little system variable. Well, you might be wondering, well, what do I mean by a system variable? Well, in PHP, there are variables, or there are bits of information that are stored automatically when you're communicating in certain ways. In this case, we're talking about post. and they're stored on the server as system values or server values, and there are different server values and there are different ways that you can access those values. And in this case, the value we're specifically looking at is the files object. And so when you do a submission, in this case a post submission to PHP, the server will then store any data that's given to it as a file object in this file object location so that you can reference it later. Well, how do you do that? I'll show you. So you got to do a couple of things here to handle this correctly, but essentially you're going to access that file through this files object that's on the PHP server. So to do this right, the first thing we're going to want to do is start off with a directory. We're going to want to give it a directory name, and that directory name is going to be where this upload or where this file is going to be stored. In this case, I just took a generic file name, had it be uploads. Make sure that exists. If it doesn't exist, it'll throw an error when you try and use it later on. So the next thing you want to do is you want to say, okay, well, I want to get just the name of the file that the person uploaded. Well, what do I mean by that? So assume you have a file on your system that you go to upload. And that file is in this directory. And then in that directory, and it's called inbetween.u. Well, what base name returns is the in between and the .u. So it basically takes everything from the path and chops it off. And then remember, the period will concatenate things together. So we take our directory, remember that is going to be our file we're going to store it in, and we concatenate the base name boink.boink. Now, I'll start by just making a quick note. This isn't the best way to do this, and I'll explain why in a second here when we're done going over just how to do this in general, and it should make sense to you. So the next thing we do is we get our file extension, which can be useful because we might need to check to make sure it's the right file type. Say we only want them to submit docx files or a picture file, right? So we say we only want you to be able to submit JPEG files. So we use pathinfo, and pathinfo allows us to give a parameter which will select information from the path name that you give it, which the user, gives it when it goes to upload the file. So what I mean is when you click on the file upload link in your web browser, that file path is then going to be broken down here in these two with these two little codes of line or lines of code, which can then allow you to check the file extension and also check to or also set it up for later use and storage. Another couple cool little things that you can do is you can check to make sure that it's not too big of a file, and you can also check to see if the target path already exists. So someone, if they're trying to upload, a file with the same name, you can throw an error and handle that. So the size thing is kind of interesting because remember I told you that everything returned is returned in this file if it's a file. So when you upload the file with this form, it comes back with the ID that you give it or the name that you give it. In this case, it's file up name, and then it has an associative array value for size. And you can check to see if it's, greater than, a certain size. So that's what's going on there. Of course, once you're all said and done and you pass all the checks that you want it to, you can actually physically upload the file onto your server, and you do that simply by accessing the file by name and the target path using move uploaded file, and it will grab the file and then copy that to your target path. Now, I mentioned it's not the best thing. It's not the most secure thing to do, because what happens if someone uploads a file that has a file name that's got script in it, or they've scripted a file name specifically in a way that will execute upon saving it? And that is possible. So what you actually want to do is, instead of saving the file name directly like we did here and saying, okay, well, I'm going to save it as a base name, the better way to do it is to disguise that and create some association to a key or a hash value or some randomization that allows you to store that indirectly, and then it prevents any sort of file name execution problems that may arise, say, with however it may be stored or executed or whatnot. There are a few security vulnerabilities that I'm not going to go into that can be circumvented by just simply not storing the file name used by the or provided by the user, or the file it's possibly has a malicious intent or whatnot. So it's not necessarily going to prevent everything, but it's kind of a good way to do it. So if you don't understand what I'm talking about there, don't worry about it. Just look up best practices for storing files in with PHP, and you'll see what I'm talking about there. So another thing I'm going to talk about briefly is PHP cookies. So in PHP, you can set a cookie on a machine. A cookie is basically a little bit of data that's stored locally on every machine that visits your or visits your web page or access this PHP document. And it's pretty straightforward. A cookie has a name, a value, an expiration date. It can have a storage path. It can have an origin domain, some security related hobnob, and then you can set it whether or not you want it to be HTTP only. I've never used any of these. Usually I only use value, expire, and name. Pretty straightforward. You say set cookie, you give it a name, and some data. I just made up some data. You can then check to see if the cookie. Before I mention that, so one way to check to make sure that the person that's visiting your page supports cookies is you can say, okay, well, I'm going to set a cookie real quick, and if it's not set after you've set it, then you determine they're not using cookies. One, it's pretty basic. You say, okay, well, I'm going to set a cookie. If it doesn't work, you assume cookies are not supported. Pretty straightforward there. All right. You can modify an existing cookie. Basically, just rewrite it. To delete a cookie, easy way to do it is you set the cookie again, but this time you set the cookie with a time that is before the current time, and then it'll be deleted the next time the browser resets, removed by the browser automatically. Another way to see if cookies exist are to do count and check to see if the count for cookies is greater than 0. That's also a way to check to see if the cookies are enabled properly. And that's pretty much cookies in general. Pretty much work the same way, functionality-wise, as most languages. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is sessions. So sessions in PHP is kind of a confusing thing. We'll try and go over it in a brief but we'll try to go over it briefly, but provide an explanation that's satisfying enough to help you guys understand what's going on. Basically, as a session is simply this. When a user accesses a web page, every time that web page reloads, any information on that web page is potentially lost, because when it reloads, all the information that was entered by the user or used by the user has to be discarded so that when it can reload the new page. Well, that's a problem if you want to do pretty much anything nowadays in web pages, because there's always a reason why you'd want to keep information as a user navigates from page to page or navigates to new information or whatnot. Say you wanted to create a login, say you wanted to create a blog, say you wanted to create this and that. It's vital to be able to store information across navigation. So one way of doing that is PHP allows you to start a session so that whatever PHP activity is made or is done will stand during that session, so that a user can, say, navigate through a couple of PHP pages or through a couple of HTML pages or load multiple HTML information, but they stay in the same PHP session, which allows them to access data across those pages. And so you're basically giving it a what's a good way to think? So essentially what you end up with is a way of holding on to data in a way that you could never do before, and PHP provides that with sessions. So how to use them is pretty straightforward. You say session start, and then you have your session keyword to allow you access to the session object, and then you simply give it associative values, key and value pairs. So now session will store value 1 and not let go of it until the session is destroyed. So this would allow me to say load up Bob Ross PHP when I first navigate to the page and do something, and then allow the user to maybe navigate around my web page, and then later on use this value 1 in another part of the web page for another reason, and it would be where we left it. So that is a session in a nutshell. Like we said, session object, associative key, and value. You can access them, and the assignment and access is just like normal variables. We can access an individual, or if I want, I can actually access all of them at once as an entire object. If I want to unset one of the values, say I wanted to, remove that, I can use session unset. Or if I want to unset all of them, I can just, if I want to unset all of these values, say you're done and you're like, okay, well, I have a bunch of these values set, and I want to unset them all so that I can reset them again. You can do that by just calling unset. Clears them all out. They're still there, so if you were to call this, it would just be null instead of non-existent or undefined. So it basically, the difference between destroy and unset is that destroy destroys the value completely. Unset just basically sets them to null. Again, we can destroy all of them at once, which would then make every session value that we had created up above, like we had here, all would be destroyed. They'd just be undefined. We can do one at a time as well. Another really handy thing in PHP is filters. Filters are really handy for doing all sorts of cool stuff. Say we had some user information and they were trying to be funny, so they entered in some hypertext reference into some form submission trying to be a butthole. Well, we could clean that out really easily by using the filter function, and we can say, oh, okay, well, here's a value which stores this information entered in by the user, say, and we want to filter that and sanitize that string. And what it'll do is it'll crap out the information we had here minus the HTML tags. So now the original HTML tags around it would be removed, and we could just use the text in between. So there's a really simple, easy way of using filter. Another way would be to say, hey, is this value an integer? Or is this value a valid IP? So filter has these predefined filter values that you can, validation values, if you will, that you can enter in, and these keywords allow you to check for things. There's quite a few of these that are available. I just picked two really handy ones that I thought would be useful to, or excuse me, I picked two that I thought would be handy and useful for the explanation. So of course we just simply say, well, is value an integer? And of course it's gonna pass. But if the filter fails, it's going to say no. And of course here we say, well, is 100 a valid IP address? No, it's not. Taking a closer look, basically we say not filter value is equal to false. Well, I'm using triple equals here, remember, because I wanted to compare false as a Boolean value. Not the word false, but the Boolean value false. So remember, Boolean is just true and false, and commonly represented by the keyword true and false in programming languages, as it is in PHP. I guess I didn't mention that above. I just assume most people understand that is pretty much the same across all programming platforms. Alright, so let's talk about a little bit about error handling. Error handling in PHP is a very good practice. When I see people that don't use error handling, it's rather frustrating. I'm always amazed at how people can write code and it's just ridiculous. It's so badly written and so badly assembled. It throws errors that are uncaught, has exceptions that are uncaught. Do not be one of those people. Learn from the beginning how to do it correctly, and use good coding practice. So using proper error handling. So let's look at this example. Sometimes you call a function, it produces an error. So what happens if I try to open idon'texist.txt for read? Well, idon'texist.txt doesn't exist, of course, and it's going to throw an error. So we wouldn't want to do that. But what happens if you're writing code and you're not really sure if someone is or is not going to have that file there for you, but you need to make sure if it is there, you can use it? Well, how do you do that? You use files exists, and you say, hey, well, if the file does not exist, handle the error. If it does, execute as normal. And that's error handling in a nutshell. Pretty straightforward. There are advanced error handling that you can do. You can create custom error functions. Pretty simple. Function my error, have an error number and error text. And pretty much, straightforward. You can set that error handler with a name. And down here you can see I basically said that I'm going to do more on this in a later video, because creating custom error handlers is kind of a specific thing, and it really is something that requires kind of its own video. It's not something for the basics video, I suppose, here. So next thing we're going to talk about is exceptions, which is similar to an error, but is more of a way of throwing an error but elegantly failing. I like to say that exceptions are a way of elegantly failing. And what I mean by that is, Let's take a look at this function check. So in the function check, we're simply checking to see if the value is equal to 1. Remember, because we have a function here, and then we pass a value into it, and then we use a conditional statement to say if that value is equal to 1, throw an exception, because we don't want that value to be equal to 1. We only want to return a value if it's not 1. So basically this check function checks to see if a value is equal to the word to the not actually here I'm going to change this. I'm going to have it so it checks to see if it's the number 1 in this case, not the object, just so we can be clear here. So it's going to check to see if it's the number 1. And if it is the number 1, it throws an exception and it says, oh, you've given me the value 1. If it doesn't, it returns that value. So to use exceptions and to manage exceptions and handle exceptions properly, you use what's called a try-catch block. And a try-catch block is actually super duper handy because it allows you to break down and handle exceptions and handle errors, if you will, on a per happenstance or per instance situation, and manage them on the fly. So what you can do is you can say, well, I'm going to try and do this check function, but I'm going to check to see if 1, the text value 1 in ASCII text, so ASCII text 1 is equal to the number 1. Of course, it's not, so we're not going to throw an exception here. But if I was to actually check to see if 1 was equal to 1, it will throw an exception, and then you can catch that exception and then, either log an error or do this or do that. And you might be thinking, well, isn't that like the same thing that you just did before, where you just had an error log and whatnot? Well, kind of, but here's the benefit. What I can do is I can have a bunch of functions that all throw different types of exceptions. And then I can have one try-catch block that manages all of those exceptions, and then individually, instead of trying to do error handling per situation and have lots of, every time an error exists, have an individual response and blah, 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 we just have a bunch of exceptions, and then anytime any exception is handled or is thrown, we handle it with our exception handler, essentially with the try-catch block. And so there are articles out there, in fact, that also allow you to do the same thing as I was talking about here with custom error handlers. You can do the exact same with custom exception handlers. Of course, I'm not going to talk about that because it's a little bit above the basic scope. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about in the basic PHP tutorial here is going to be using PHP with MySQL. So I'm not going to get really far into this. I actually decided I'm going to do an entire tutorial specifically on using PHP and MySQL, but I figured I'd do a quick rundown so at least you had an introduction, so that then when you took a look at the MySQL, you'd have a little bit already on your plate there, a little bit familiar with the use of PHP and MySQL. Let me make a quick note. This is a very, very handy tool to have. Using databases with PHP is super valuable. You'll hear people talk about it, good, bad, indifferent. I've been doing this for years, and it's a great way to manage databases and to access databases. It creates very fluent and functional web pages, and web design can be very or can improve greatly by the use, simply by adding some MySQL into it. All right, so let's talk about what we're going to get into here. So PHP basically has 3 separate forms in which database communication is fashioned with PHP. You have object-oriented, or MySQL, as I like to say, you have PDO style and you have MySQL procedural. Both or all three, of course, allow communication, but little different syntax. So the first thing we'll talk about is object-oriented MySQLi. So the first thing we're going to look at here, of course, we have to start off with a few variables that are going to be initialized to provide information to the server location, the username, and the password to the server. Basically your server name, if you will. So in our case, we're just going to say it's localhost. We're going to say username and taco1234 for a password. So in order to create a communication channel to your database, one needs to create a new communication object. That's done by calling new MySQLi, providing the server username, password, and then of course setting that all equal to a variable to store the returned value from the object. So now you have this object that you've stored in the DB connector, which can now be used for communication. It's always important to use try-catch blocks, of course, to handle the exceptions, saying that if there's a MySQL error, blah blah blah, throw some new exception. I just showed a little example of how you can actually put error handling inside of a try-catch block. Kind of redundant error handling there. Of course, one thing that you have to note, just like when we opened a file, when you open a connection to a database, when you're done, you got to make sure you close it. All right, so with PDO style, we just surround the entire thing with a try-catch block, because if you try to create a connection to the database and it fails, it will just throw an exception automatically, and so you just can handle that by doing it here. One thing to note here, the difference between the styles, the difference between PDO, MySQL, and object-oriented, all it is just the way the way and the form that you set it up. See, of course, here we say new PDO. We use a little bit different for the first parameter. We provide the server, and we actually provide the database name itself. In addition to that, we do another call which sets the attribute and exception mode. Finally, a little different method has to be used when finished, closing the connection to the PDO connection object. Lastly, we have procedural method here. Again, same thing, little different syntax. We check for error, close it when we're done. Now, you might be wondering, okay, well that's all great and everything, so I open it, what do I do with it? So I just decided, well, I'm going to give a quick little demonstration of how to actually do a quick insert using object-oriented, and then I'll talk more about this in the entire tutorial on this later. But essentially, it's this simple. Like we did above, create our new object, store it in a variable, check to make sure the connection was successful. Then we come down here and we make what's called a query. So in MySQL, you use things called query statements, and these query statements talk to the database and they say, do something. Now, the reason why I said I want to do a complete tutorial on this in and of itself is there's a lot of intricacies and a lot of different types of and methods of using this insert statement, and so there's an entire tutorial that I can make specifically around this highlighted line right here. So the query itself is the business end of the communication between PHP and your MySQL database. So in this case, we create a query and then actually send that query to the database, and then it'll either successfully or it will either execute successfully or fail miserably. Now, one quick note here. This is a security vulnerability that was the focus of a major vulnerability that existed for undetected for a number of years, in fact, before it was publicly divulged. And actually, what I'm doing here opens this up to what's called MySQL injection. And so I will talk about all of that in the video later on. Watch for it in the next few weeks. From the video, should be pretty good. I think I'll try and cover just about everything I can on using PHP with MySQL and the security vulnerabilities. What, good practice, things you want to watch for and such. So moving right along here, we're almost finished here. Quick thing you can do, DOM manipulation is directly possible through PHP. If I wanted to, I could directly access a DOM object by saying DOM document, and then load load directly to that, and then print information from that. So not a lot on that. That's kind of another tutorial in and of itself. I think the last thing that I'm going to finish up here with to close up is we're just going to talk about a little bit about object-oriented programming and classes. And this will provide us with a good stopping point, I think, for the beginning tutorial. This is going to really kind of push the boundaries of the initial basics, and so I'm just going to really briefly cover this, and then I'll come back to it in a short video so that really we can explain this all. But PHP has what's called object-oriented programming, and it allows you OOP. It allows you to create what are called classes or class objects. And so this is just a little visual of what a class object looks like. You name it with a class variable keyword. Excuse me. There's a keyword that you initialize it with to declare it, and then it has what's called a function constructor, and the constructor will actually allow it to be created. And so I'm going to go ahead and just kind of leave it there. Like I said, I will go ahead and do an entire video specifically on using classes and how they're created and how you can create functions that are only available to the class itself, and functions that can be called externally from the class using the class itself, and allow you to kind of get a good understanding, hopefully, of what they are and how to use them. So I think I'll go ahead and stop it there. It's a pretty lengthy tutorial so far, and so I do apologize for having to string it out so long, but I wanted to try and take all of the basics from PHP, slump them all together in one tutorial in one spot, and give everybody a chance to kind of have a good reference to it. So hopefully everyone was able to follow as I went along there. I apologize if some of it was a little bit quick or confusing for you. Hopefully everything was clear and easy to understand. So again, I do thank you for coming and spending some time checking out this tutorial. Like I said, I had a few people ask me about it and were interested in having me put this out. So I went ahead and threw it together for you.